Marlinga is a well-known public figure and public servant in this area and has served in a variety of capacities for many years. If I remember correctly, Carl, you're a graduate of the University of Michigan, both undergraduate?
No, University of Detroit undergrad and U of M Law School.
U of M Law School. You did serve as an assistant U.S. attorney, which is a prosecutor's role, and U.S. attorneys are usually at the pinnacle, considered, at least before the Bush administration started putting some political hacks in some districts, not I think in Eastern District, but that might be an issue. The pinnacle of the legal profession, and it's a distinguished way to start a career. He worked as a defense attorney and was elected and served for many years as prosecutor, chief prosecuting attorney of Macomb County. Let me introduce Mr. Carl Marlinga.
I'm going to talk about the three things that Professor Solomon told us about, but I'm going to do it in a way in which things are not clearly stratified. Now I'm going to talk about the role of the prosecutor. I'm going to talk about this case in which I thought that there might have been a wrongful conviction, and now I'm going to talk about my experience in the criminal justice system as a defendant that arose as a result of some things I did in that case in which I thought the person had been wrongfully convicted. But I just want to say just a couple of things at the outset. The criminal justice system works pretty well most of the time. In fact, it works so well to such a high degree that prosecutors, and understandably because they come from a certain point of view, but unfortunately appellate judges and other judges as well begin to have this feeling that claims made by a defendant that there was a wrongful conviction are immediately suspect. Because after all, if you take a look at the people in prison and talk to them, there will be 100% of the people there who will say that for some reason or the other they were wrongfully convicted. The people who are wrongfully convicted will say that it was wrong, but the people who were rightly convicted will also say it's wrong. And so it's very hard from just a survey of people in prison to get a good count of how many times this was accurate and how many times it wasn't. And there's no good methodology really to figure out exactly what the percentage is. I remember some years ago Professor Zalman sent around a survey to the Prosecuting Attorneys Association asking us what our belief was as to how many times in the course of a year, either in absolute numbers or on a percentage basis, is it likely that we have convicted an innocent person. And I remember saying, well, just on a statistical basis, human beings being fallible people, I would have to think that if this happened even 1% of the time in a county my size, that would mean that 10,000 cases that we put through, that there would be 100 people that were wrongfully convicted. And I said to myself, no, that can't be right. We couldn't have convicted 100 innocent people, so it's got to be somewhat less than 1%. And then I started to try to figure out, well, how would you go about this anyway? Because after all, every single case in which you find out that somebody was convicted and the conviction later gets reversed, not just because of a technical error, but because of actual innocence, every single time that a prosecutor finds that out, he or she springs to action and does the right thing and files a motion to have the person released from custody. The problem, of course, is that there's this difference of opinion all the time as to whether or not this claim of a wrongful conviction is actually correct. And one of the big challenges, I think, for criminal justice classes, more so than law school classes, is to figure out if there is some kind of methodology to pin that number down. I remember, I had met Professor Zalman, but I was not good friends with him at the time, and I remember at a Prosecuting Attorneys Association meeting up in Macomb, his name was tossed about, and you weren't talked of kindly, because people were thinking that you're trying to create statistics where none really existed. In part, the criticism was true, but I spoke up saying that, well, at least he's making this attempt, and I think all of us in good faith have to fill in these surveys so that we get some kind of statistical basis. And I remember at the end of the meeting, a couple of prosecutors said that they would, but most said that they wouldn't, which kind of disappointed me in the group. But in order to make the point of how important it is to try to figure out how often this happens, I think the best thing that I could do is to take you through the story of a couple of actual cases and to show you how difficult it is to get a review of a case when somebody is wrongfully convicted. And I'm going to start off with a case called People versus Muldowan. Jeffrey Muldowan was a young man when back in 1990, or 91, I guess I'm kind of like fuzzy on the dates right now myself. There was a case in our county in which a young woman had been abducted at the hands of allegedly 4 young men, that at the end of that abduction she had been brutally assaulted. Brutally assaulted in part in a way that the criminal sexual conduct statute was involved, because a starburst pipe, one of these metal pipes that had been smashed down so that the metal folded back on itself, had been shoved into her rectum, and as it pulled out, part of her intestines were pulled out. So it was indeed a criminal sexual conduct, but over and above the horrific nature of that crime, it was truly an assault with intent to either maim or murder. The 4 people, or however many number of people who did this to her, were certainly brutish and unforgivably violent towards this woman. And that, of course, happens a lot in the criminal justice system. And the response that we have as human beings when something so bad happens is that we naturally want to get the people who did it. And so law enforcement typically puts greater amounts of resources into those cases in which the crimes are particularly heinous, where the injuries are particularly severe, or where death occurs. And this, of course, before I get too far into the story, I'll do these little asterisks as we go along. This natural and, for the most part, good and decent human tendency to want to strike back at people who hurt us, strike back at people who victimize us, and leave people maimed and near death, or actually produce death. This tendency, while it looks on the face of it to be natural and understandable and good in most respects, creates a little side spin that is not so good. The University of Michigan Journal of Law Reform some years ago did a study on the number of cases in which DNA or other types of scientific evidence had shown that convictions were incorrectly obtained. And it came to a fairly high number of like maybe 10 to 15% of the cases that they looked at. And then the suggestion was made that, well, look, if these results were yielded in cases in which you had the most serious crimes, where law enforcement was bringing the most resources to bear, if you could have as high as 15% error rate in those most serious crimes, where everybody's trying to do everything right, what does that tell us about the lesser crimes? It must be 30%, 40%, maybe it's just random.